Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Everything is Ideology. I'm your host, Lee Kaplan. Today, I'm joined by Amanda Batarseh, an assistant professor of literature whose teaching and research span Palestinian literature, Arabic literature, Arab American and diasporic literature, Indigenous Studies, Mediterranean Studies, and comparative literature. A conversation centers on her work on radical Palestinian epistemology and what she describes as a Palestinian-centered way of knowing. Beginning with the limits of simply applying inherited European theoretical frameworks to Palestinian cultural production, Batarseh asks us to consider Palestinian literature not merely as something to be interpreted through theory, but as a site that produces knowledge and theory of its own. From there, we discuss the colonial unknowing, not simply an absence of information about Palestine, but structures of knowledge that can render Palestinian histories, experiences, and claims unintelligible even when Palestinians have narrated those histories for generations. This pushes us beyond the question of who has permission to narrate and toward a deeper question: what determines whether a narrative can be recognized as knowledge in the first place? We also turn to literature, poetry, and imagination as forms of political and epistemological practice. Palestinian cultural production does not simply document oppression. It can preserve relationships to land, transmit memory, and create alternative geographies and imagine forms of life beyond the structures that we seek to contain them. Literature, in this sense, becomes a space of radical creativity whose possibilities extend outward from the individual toward collective liberation. This becomes especially important in our discussion of cartography and Batarseh's concept of rooted movement. Against colonial maps that transform land into bounded territory and property, Palestinian narratives can orient people through memory, movement, story, ancestry, and lived relationships to place. Rootedness, then, does not necessarily mean remaining fixed. Palestinian ways of knowing can be grounded in Palestine while moving across exile, diaspora, language, political struggle, and intellectual traditions. If you like what we do here, please consider becoming a Patreon at patreon.com/everythingisideology or give a donation at buymeacoffee.com/everythingisideology. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Everything is Ideology. I'm your host, Lee Kaplan. Today, I'm joined by Amanda Batarseh, and she's an assistant professor of literature whose teaching and research focuses on Palestinian literature, Arabic literature, Arab American and Arab diasporic literature, Indigenous Studies, Mediterranean Studies, and comparative literature. Her research has been supported by the UC Humanities Research Institute, the Hellman Fellowship, Faculty Career Development Program, and the UC President's Postdoctoral Fellowship Program. So thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me.
My pleasure.
Yeah, so today we're going to talk about something that you recently published. Would you mind telling us a little bit about the goal of your article and what you're trying to do within this piece on radical Palestinian epistemology and what that even means and might look like?
I guess I'll go back a little bit to explain how I got to this article. I have to go back to grad school. I was a grad student at UC Davis in the Department of Comparative Literature. Wonderful faculty, wonderful mentorship, but didn't really know, as I think is common with a lot of graduate students, what I was getting into. And I wasn't really trained in comparative literature. I had studied art history as an undergraduate student, did major detours in my life through other fields, including even business, learning that was not me at all. And coming back to Arabic, the study of Arabic and Arabic literature as an adult or a young adult, and kind of happened upon grad school as an avenue into continuing a study of Arabic that I absolutely loved. And I didn't really know what comparative literature was. So I was learning along the ways about the histories of this field. And as I was doing that, I was learning literary theory, continental theory, critical theory, and trying to find these ways to approach these Palestinian texts that I was in love with, and really struggling with this kind of copy-paste approach of critical theory. And of course, I'm probably butchering this for people who are really in love with the frameworks provided to us by comparative literature. And there is so much there. But this kind of copy-paste idea that because the novel was quote unquote imported to Palestine through the experience of the Arab awakening in the 19th century, but also then colonialism, that then we could just use European theorists of the novel to read Palestinian literature. So that's really where my struggle with epistemology began, because I was trying to figure out how to read these texts and feeling frustrated and unfulfilled by the theoretical models that I was inheriting through kind of traditional comparative literature structures of knowledge. So that moves me into my dissertation project, and that gets me into my book on what I land on, which is radical movement, as I'm trying to develop an Indigenous Palestine-centered epistemology for reading literary texts and cultural products. And then in October 2023, when I'm pretty much almost done with this book, the genocide begins. And there's this whole other kind of struggle that is embedded in my work, which is about not only how do we read literature, but how do we know, and specifically, how do we know Palestine? And what resurfaces again in 2023, which of course, as I address in this article with the works of Edward Said and more contemporary thinking, like Muhammad al-Kurd, the problem with how we learn about Palestine or know about Palestine is a struggle with these frameworks of knowledge that make us as humans, that make our stories unintelligible in the way that they're transmitted and understood by a non-Palestine-centered epistemology. So this article was kind of a reflection on how I worked through writing the book in this time of genocide or resurgence of genocide, and why I feel like this book also offers us something beyond just literary analysis, but opens us up to a way of moving and thinking in the world that is radical in the sense that it allows us to not only understand the Palestinian struggle, but also other struggles in the world, that Palestine is kind of a nexus point that can open us up to how we can imagine liberated futures.
Thank you so much for that opening, and especially drawing on what you just stated at the end, where it's just like Palestine connects us to other forms of liberated futures. It brings to mind just different sort of Black feminist studies, with particularly Audre Lorde, who talks about poetry is not a luxury. You draw on poetry very much in different ways. You start the piece with a poem, and then you talk about this poem and this literature functioning as a form of Palestinian pedagogy. And then you also bring in Kanafani, who always brings in culture as basically another means of resistance, right? There's something that like a gun and a poem do at the same time, because the effects of the gun and the poem are the same to Kanafani. So it's like, if people die over writing poems and people die over being resistance fighters, then they're one and the same, right? They're in the same struggle in different ways as a result of the consequence. That idea like really blew me away when I first encountered it. I was like, yeah, that's kind of it. And you also bring in these beautiful examples of Al-Rassam Al-Fayed or something like this, who's talking at the commemoration in Gaza. And you brought in how there were some poets that were martyred, and we shouldn't necessarily be surprised that there were poems. So there's questions of basically what is considered human and who is considered human and who gets to tell a story, and these questions are kind of inextricably bound to kind of like what counts as knowledge. So can you talk about what you were doing with Edward Said's work, The Permission to Narrate, and how you draw on that but push back on it and move it forward in different ways?
Yeah, absolutely. So Permission to Narrate and Said have been critical to my thinking. I mean, with so many scholars, not only post-colonial scholars, but of course Palestinian scholars. Throughout my career, my short career as a scholar and hopefully activist, because in culture and imperialism and Orientalism, Edward Said really opens up a door for us as literary and cultural scholars to de-obfuscate this artificial divide between the production of art and the sphere of politics, and shows us that the ways in which the European novel is itself very much embedded and invested in the production of a civilizational narrative of East and West that ostensibly codifies and legitimizes imperial conquest, the necessity for it, the kind of white man's burden of bringing civilization. And even though it might not always be as visible as it is in works like Heart of Darkness, he's able to locate it in works that we might not associate with colonialism and empire, like Jane Austen, right? And so this really helped me articulate a struggle in the critique of Palestinian literature, which is a critique that we get in third world literature. I use that in the kind of appropriation of the third world, right, and the third world movement. That politics always kind of takes over the aesthetic in a way that diminishes its quality, or that there's always this tension between the political and the artistic, as though politics isn't embedded in every form of cultural production, that it's always there, and there's no neutral cultural form that is purely aesthetic. So going from there, I promise I'm getting us to permission to narrate. I then read Culture and Imperialism. Again, I'm going back to my kind of my entrance into finding an Indigenous-centered epistemology for Palestinian cultural analysis. Go to Cultural Imperialism, where this is delved into even further. The second half of the book, or not even the second half, but the second part towards the end of that work, is really invested in trying to think through, okay, what's happening in the literature of the colonized. And for better or worse, this is not the strength of Said's argument. Like, he's very, very strong in giving us a clear lens into what empire is doing and how it proliferates through culture. But the analysis in the later part of Cultural Imperialism of third world literatures doesn't give us a solid grounding in an epistemology that is rooted in the places from which they are produced. And so Permission to Narrate is another work that, like Orientalism, helps us see what Said talks about as the imaginative geography in those first two works, which is the way in which the empire constructs the East, or the geographies of the other, first through imaginative production. That this happens in the cultural realm before soldiers ever touch the ground, right? That work is absolutely critical to imperial expansion and conquest, again, because it creates that civilizational narrative that justifies and imagines this state of progress that the empire is going to either bring to the people or to the place, because the people in some instances are just the conduit to the progress, not the targets of the progress. So in these earlier works, we get an idea about how this functions again in colonial works of literature, in the early novel, and how it moves into these colonial territories. But we again don't get a way to understand how does imaginative geography work for the indigenous creator, right? Is it going to just reproduce those same kind of destructive, imaginative tropes, or is it doing something radically different? So in Permission to Narrate, what Said helps us see is that it's also profoundly this kind of imaginative geography, this way of knowing the world is profoundly embedded within multiple narrative forms, not just the novel, right? But in the narratives we weave in journalism, in the way that we teach, in the way that we talk about even spaces in the world in our everyday discourse. And so what he's trying to get us to understand is that because there's a structure, the structures of knowledge about how we know the world are narrative. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the narratives about Palestine are missing a lot of content. The narratives that are received, for example, which we saw so frequently after October 7th, was the narrative begins with October 7th and not October 6th and October 5th, right? So the start date and the end date are really, really important for Palestinian history, because if you obscure everything that happened before 1948, then there is no logic there is no impetus, there is no history of Palestinian suffering, there is no history of Palestinian genocide, because this isn't the first genocidal conquest of Palestine. In 1948, 15,000 Palestinians at least 15,000 Palestinians are killed, and 750,000 Palestinians are exiled. That's genocidal intent, the intent to destroy and replace. And then that is reproduced time and again, not to the same intensity and degree that we've seen for the past 3 years, but it's present. It's present in the history for more than 75 years now. So what Said is trying to help us understand is that we have to understand these narrative frameworks if we're going to tell the story of Palestine, to make it legible to the world. And Palestinians have been doing this. Palestinians have, I've never seen a place in the world with so many memoirs. We have so many memoirs. Palestinians have been narrating our history, making our oral histories, written histories, writing in English. One of the first scholars I address in my book, which isn't the first Palestinian scholar to write in English, but is Tawfiq Kanaan, who wrote his ethnographies of the Palestinian Faleh, of the Palestinian peasantry in the early 1900s, and was writing treatises. In 1936, he published 2 in English to the Anglophone world about the Palestinian cause. So Palestinians have been narrating Palestinian history and histories of displacement and the desire for sovereignty and liberation since before 1948. So the question then becomes, not that Said is wrong, right? These narrative structures need to be understood in order to bring our history, our worldview, our humanity to the world. But if Palestinians have been doing this for decades upon decades, artworks that have been, shown at the Venice Biennale by Anne-Marie Jesser, films, we have an incredible archive of film, Palestinian film. Obviously, my area of expertise, the novel, short stories, poetry, and not just in Arabic and not just in English. So why? if let's say we only learned this in 1984 when Permission to Narrate was published, which we know is not true. But let's say Palestinians just discovered this in 1984. Oh, we've just been telling the story wrong this whole time. Why is it then in 40 years, people can still see a genocide happening? The most widely publicized, moment by moment, graphic, in graphic detail genocide, day after day, with the evidence piling up, and not know, not be sure, not feel like they have the whole story, or that there's a complexity that they just can't understand. What renders something that's so obvious so unknowable or so uncertain? And so that's where I'm trying to get to in this article, is that yes, there is a kind of narrative repair that has to happen to make our works, our lives, our humanity. I almost hate to use that word because it almost feels like it's become useless in these past 3 years, if not longer, legible to the world. But it has to be something else, right? There has to be something else going on that isn't just that we're not telling the story right. So that question then led me to, and again, I'm not the one who discovers this concern for epistemological violence and colonial unknowing. This is obviously resonates in third world struggles and anti-colonial struggles that we are aligned with as Palestinians, invested not just in Palestinian liberation but human liberation. But led me to this question of a fundamental epistemological violence, epistemology being, the way of knowing, that renders Palestine and Palestinians suspect, our narrative suspect, that renders our very right to want to live normal lives suspect, that renders our children suspect, targets of violence, that makes the humanity of our men suspect no matter what. What is it that does that? Beyond just Orientalism, beyond just Islamophobia, that's integral to it. But there's something that's happening in just the way we are understood that feels deeper than kind of the way that racism gets packaged as an individual fault. And we know that that's not the way it works. But yeah, so that's the way. That's kind of where the article is digging back into permission to narrate and saying, okay, we got the memo. We know we have the right to narrate. We don't need to ask permission from anybody, and we've been doing that. So why is it not enough? And my reply to that is that at the foundations of the way we know is a logic that was not ever intended to accommodate or serve us, right? And that doesn't mean that we don't ever turn to European or other kind of global theories and ways of knowing and interrogating the world. It doesn't mean that we're shut off from the world and we have to return to some kind of untouched Palestinian epistemology that predates colonization. It just means that if people aren't able first to see the world from the lens of Palestinian knowledge to the way we interact with place and each other, then they can never see us as anything other than a casualty of a necessity of of a world order that for some reason is the best of all options. That for some reason, in order for there to be safety for all people in Palestine, we have to die. And so the article is kind of the entry point, or my reflection on my book, which is trying to excavate what a Palestine-centered epistemology could look like. And I would, or does look like, or looks like in its multiple forms. And it's not an endpoint in any way. It's more of an invitation to keep thinking through because there can't just be one way of knowing the world, right? There's not just one single Palestinian epistemology, but there are resonances across different cultural forms that can ground us in how and Palestinian relationships to place, in Palestinian communal practices, in Palestinian care, that get obfuscated by the continuous kind of brutality, grotesqueness, and numbness that people are now feeling to our mutilation and annihilation. That was a
Right.
really long answer.
No. That's great. All answers about this question need to be long to even discuss the matter in general. That's something that I feel like is language can't really provide us with something at this particular level, because you're not just talking about like what can be understood, but the people producing knowledge and whether or not the people producing knowledge are considered subjects that can produce knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just the level of narration and the forms of narration, but the conditions of possibility that lead to narration, which obviously goes deeper than like what you're talking about with Edward Said's stuff does. And you also, I mean, you get into like the ways in which knowledge is transferred and produced, and how, through basically speaking poetry rather than just writing it down, it evades colonial visibility and surveillance, because it's harder to police something that's quote unquote intangible in different ways, right? And this gets to like different modes of knowledge production from like Palestinian political prisoners and stuff, like smuggling out texts or even smuggling out sperm to create a new life, and all of these amazing heroic sort of events and spectacular things. But it just seems like it's not even about the stories that can be told, but about like the believability, and like, I don't know, language falters at this scale. I believe at one point you used the term like onto-epistemological, which is sort of what it is, and it's like this condition of possibility that's also rooted in one's like relation to the place. And I guess before we move on, this is like something that gets into this that you said is the colonial unknowing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Before we move on to talk about basically rootedness and fixity and indigeneity, would you mind saying something about colonial unknowing and what might produce this situation of like indecipherability of Palestinian life?
Yeah. Sure. So I'm sorry. I had notes for myself here that were going to help keep me in line. Uh,
Yeah, take your time.
yeah. So in thinking about colonial unknowing, I'll take us back in time a little bit. So before our tolerance for genocidal violence against Palestinians was kind of tested to the degree that it has been today. And I'm going to talk about Operation Cast Lead. So Operation Cast Lead took place from December 27th, 2008 to January 18th, 2009. And up to that point in time, this military assault was the deadliest documented assault on Gaza and our people by human rights organizations and the UN up to that point in Gaza since the beginning of the 1967 occupation. So and when I say deadliest, both in terms of the number of people killed, which was at least 1,400 at that time over a 22-day period, but also in intensity, because it combined aerial, naval, and ground scale attacks, assaults on Palestinian civilians. Tens of thousands of homes were destroyed, and then things were also very attuned to now, the targeting of hospitals, of schools, of mosques, and then, of course, the basic infrastructure as well. So really the annihilation of livability with any kind of grace or basic humanity. So in this, the other reason Operation Cast Lead is kind of a critical marker for what becomes the kind of annual or biannual assault on Gaza that continues every year or so up until the present, is that during Operation Cast Lead, white phosphorus was used. And it obviously, as one of the most densely populated areas in the world, white phosphorus was used on civilian areas, civilian populated areas, which is a war crime. The use of white phosphorus, I looked this up, apparently is not a war crime, which is crazy. But the use of white phosphorus on populated civilian areas is. So to explain what happens to a human when they're exposed to white phosphorus, the physical effects are exceptionally severe, and they're often fatal, but not always. It is a highly toxic chemical that ignites spontaneously upon contact with oxygen, burning at temperatures of up to 1,500 degrees. It produces a thick smoke that sticks to the skin and clothing, and it burns continuously until the chemical is either entirely burned out or it's deprived of oxygen. It causes long-term health effects if it doesn't kill you. It's easily absorbed into the bloodstream through burns, which can trigger liver failure, kidney failure, and harm the cardiovascular system. So the degree to which it can disfigure, damage, harm, kill, and cause lifelong, physical and psychological ailments is horrendous. So this, I preface that, when this happened, it made the news. It was, I think in 2008, I don't know if I want to say how old I was, but I think 2008, 2009 for me was, as a young person, was a real political turning point and awakening to the Palestinian struggle. Because in my lifetime, I had not seen a violence against Palestinians to that degree yet. That doesn't mean it hadn't happened. It's just I hadn't been exposed to it through visual imagery and news coverage. So this is the context in which the poem I cite at the beginning of my article was written. The context in which the poet Rafif Ziadeh penned her poem, We Teach Life. And so she wrote this poem in response to a journalist knowing all of this as a journalist, right? This isn't just someone on the street who didn't really know the context for the struggle. They knew at least this, if nothing else, right? A journalist asked her, right, okay, all of these things you're saying are terrible, but wouldn't it just all end if you stop teaching your children to hate? This is a categorical example of colonial unknowing. This question functions as a rhetorical device that systematically shuts down Palestinian humanity. It denies Palestinian narration, refusing to know their pedagogies, teaching life to their children, their epistemologies, their ways of knowing and existing in the world as anything other than defined by hatred of Israel. As though we go through our everyday, we wake up in the morning and we say, I hate Israel, and all of my conversations are about that, and this is the only way. Oh, that's probably going to get taken out of context in a clip. As if that defines our entire being, that we don't want to have children, that we don't want to teach or work or go to our jobs or make dinner or laugh at really terrible movies. There's American films and all other kinds of films in Palestine through we have satellites, as though this is the central constitutive essence of our being, and that everything else is secondary to that, as though the hatred, if you want to call it that, the pain and suffering is something that emerges intrinsically from Palestinian or genetically carried down from generation to generation without any kind of structural, material, physical, political reality to sustain it. So even as Palestinians in Gaza are literally enduring everything that I just started with, the facts that would seem to, quote, speak for themselves, and this is what Said talks about in Permission to Narrate, that facts do not speak for themselves in the case of Palestine. It is not enough to say all of these things have happened. Crimes of war. The colonial unknowing is a form of epistemic violence that makes these facts on the ground illegible, suspect, exceptional, right? Oh, well, this is just an exceptional case, a regrettable necessity. It makes all of those facts on the ground somehow tangential to an imagined, enduring kind of Palestinian hatred or brutality or victimhood, even that we were born to die, basically, and that anything that falls upon us is of our own making. So colonial unknowing is not a simple lack of information or a passive ignorance. It's an active and ongoing production of ignorance and a structural refusal to know. It serves a key technology of colonial power that is designed to foreclose the understanding, recognition, and legitimacy not only of Palestinian, but of indigenous and colonized peoples on every level, historically, politically, narratively, epistemologically, ontologically. And so, like, a really incredible example of this is a really famous interview that Ken Afeni, the Ken Afeni interview, the sword to the neck conversation, where the journalist just keeps asking, well, why won't you talk? But why won't you just talk to the Israelis? And he says, talk about what? You've kicked us out of our land, you've killed our people, and you want me to talk about a way to maintain that system of authority. To do what then? To just talk? Because there's the structure that exists necessitates that I die. So talking just means finding a way to have peace, meaning finding a way to perpetuate the system in which I continue to be a victim in order for your state to exist in the way that it does. So by knowability, I'm referring to that deeper epistemological unintelligibility of our narrative, because to acknowledge it not only to acknowledge it, but to know it to be true. No one who knows the Palestinian history to be true and recognizes the demand for liberation from settler colonial structures of death can then say, but this system that we have in place, if we just keep working at it a little bit harder, will get us there, right? To acknowledge Palestinian ways of knowing requires a fundamental transition of how we relate to the nation state as in its very existence, premised on exclusion and property, in how we relate to one another, in terms of having responsibility to our communities and not just ourselves as an individual in the capitalist model of, accumulation and wealth. It means relating to the land, not only as a piece of property, but as a space that gives life, that carries a history, that is a space of like both change and an archive of who we are. It requires a way of relating to the world in dramatically different ways. And it's not necessarily an easy epistemology to hold, because you might feel, especially if you live in this country, as I think a lot of people do, Palestinian or not, the constant feeling of gaslighting, right? You're constantly being gaslit and told that you're crazy, that what you call liberation is death, and that what you call liberation is terrorism. And so it's not necessarily the easiest position to inhabit, but it's the one that, if we look at the Black radical tradition and struggle, if we look at Indigenous movements across the globe, we find resonances of this demand of return to community, of return to a history embedded in an understanding of place, even if that place is one that you've been removed from, in existing in radically different ways than the way we are told is normal to exist.
No, that's great. I think when we're expounding upon a form of epistemology, we sometimes need to draw on language that's understandable to then get into what's not understandable yet, or something like this. So I definitely appreciate platitudes at times. Yeah, so I mean, you touched on so many different things that brought up different points and things that kind of we've all read or known about through different times and years and stories and sort of media cycles and whatnot, right? Jamil Khader wrote about Cecil the lion and people caring more about animals than children being killed, and the biopolitics of that sort of thing. And you also touched on the militancy that's needed to stop oneself from feeling crazy by seeing the sort of truth. Like I think Laura Shihai does a lot of this, the psychic militancy thing. She does really, really essential, wonderful, kind of like life-sustaining work in that regard. And I guess I wanted to ask you a little bit about you talk about there's a tradition of Palestinian resistance literature. And it's not necessarily just resistance literature as well as it's also just simply like writing about life in some way. There's a sense in which I read something on raving in Ramallah and queer Palestinian life that talked about just mundane life within Palestine as being a form of radicalism or radicality. So I was wondering if you would talk about Palestinian resistance literature and also the role within cartography in Palestinian resistance literature, because I really, whenever I read certain materials, I think this is an alternative mapping. This is another way of understanding the land and the relationship to people, but also it's saying like this place means this. It's an alternative cartography. And it reroutes and reconfigures basically like a sort of quote unquote like master plan. Now, instead of territory A, B, C, and all of these sorts of things, you get like, oh, this is the place that I visited as a kid. And this is like, it reminds me of my mom. And then it's related to the song. And then we did this dance. Like it becomes something else. The map becomes sort of something lived and embodied rather than something to extract from and kind of own in some ways, right? So a lot of these stories to me feel like a reclaiming of land through practices of memory that map onto map making. So if you wouldn't mind talking about some of that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the article, I touch on this recorded lecture by Dr. Rifat Al-Arir, who, of course, was assassinated, was killed in 2023 by by the Zionist regime, by the Zionist entity, an assault on the home of his family member, where he and his family members were killed. And so I discuss this lecture where he is talking about the potency and the importance of really the Palestinian imagination as kind of the critical foundation for Palestinian resistance, for Palestinian continuity, for regeneration, as a source of both like succor and energy, right? All of these kinds of things that we need to sustain us through horrific trauma, to be able to imagine otherwise, right? To imagine a freedom that isn't just a return to the past, because we can't time travel. We can't undo what has been done. So we need to be able to imagine the beyond. And there's also, really great work about this in the Black radical tradition, and I'm thinking specifically of Robin D.G. Kelley, who asks us, in our struggles for liberation, and particularly with our co-strugglers, whether it's with the Black Lives Matter movement in 2014, when we saw this resurgence of solidarity between those in Gaza and those on the streets here in the United States, demanding an end to police violence and state violence, or Indigenous struggles here or across the world. To be able to focus not on just what we're fighting against, because that is leaves us open really for neutralization and co-option. If you have your endpoint being just a single goal of defeating one element of your oppression, then the oppressor can just focus in on that one element, and then the rest of the structure that made that one element possible continues, right? So you have to be able to start to ideate, what are you fighting for? What does liberation look like? What does freedom look like? Not just who is harming us and how they're harming us, but when we create both provisionally in the present and regenerating into the future liberated world, we have to recognize that that is an ongoing process, and we need to be able to produce that now in the present for its continuity into the future. So what does it mean to be liberated? That requires imagination, because we have these real material and ideological structures that surround us, that we're constantly trying to deobfuscate to see what it could look like to be free. And so in this lecture by Rifat, he says, we talk about our literary tradition. We talk about Palestinian resistance literature, and we hold it up with the highest regard, of something we turn to, of something that gives us, space to be free, even if it's just provisionally within, the recitation of a poem or reading a text or whatever it might be. But then when someone like Doreen Tatur is imprisoned for their poetry, for poetry that they post on Facebook, we kind of feign shock. Like, why would they? We would say, why would they do that? She's just a poet, right? And he reflects back on Moshe Dayan, who was a general, who said that the writing of, how am I forgetting she wrote A Mountainous Journey. I can't believe she's escaping my mind right now. But of that the Palestinian author who wrote this was like facing down the barrel of a gun. That that it was incredibly dangerous. So what we are reminded is that before, and this also takes us back to Said and imaginative geography, before Palestine was conquered in the material realm, it was conquered in the imaginative realm. It was conquered through the production of Zionist literature. It was conquered, and he doesn't say this, but it was conquered through the map, right? In the division of Palestine, in the Sykes-Picot, or all of the, Bilad Hashem and the Arab region, into areas of control, of authority by the French and the British in 1916, by the subsequent maps that emerge over and over, segregating the territories and creating areas of influence, areas of property, areas of authority that do not at all align with the way in which Palestine and Greater Syria functioned for centuries, if not more. We can go back millennia into deep historical time, without these kinds of firm boundaries of the nation state, and yet still had identities of place and peoplehood that contest the kind of myth about the nation state as somehow an organic structure that emerged through progressive time and is kind of this apex of human governance, right? And so, he's telling us we hold up Palestinian resistance literature, and then in the same breath we diminish it. And so this is, the kind of, again, internalized way of knowing epistemology that we've inherited, even unwillingly, about the role of literature and the role of poetry and the role of the creative realm as, when it reaches its apex, somehow being separate from politics, when in reality, like we said, all art is embedded with an ideology. It's whether or not you're aware of it or not, and whether your ideology is rooted in something liberatory or in something else. And we know this about the emergence of the European novel, that it's very much not only aligned with the emergence of the nation state and of imperialism, but also of the individual and the bourgeoisie. And right, if you've studied the European literature at all, you are aware of how this history aligns, and yet for some reason that's apolitical. And so I think the reason I really also came back to that when I was working on this book was, as I note in the article, is I really struggled, like so many of us, following October 2023. Like, how do I write this book now? Am I this work that is almost a decade of my life, right, from graduate school through being a junior scholar, is it just obfuscating or covering up or beautifying something in the most urgent moment of our struggle? When, is this superfluous to what I need to be doing right now? And it helped return me to the importance of thinking about literature, of thinking about imagination in this way, as a space of radical creativity with a collective aim, not an individual aim. It's not about individual consumption and individual reflection. It's about, it can start there, but the literature is supposed to then turn you outwards to the world. It's not just, if Ken Effendi didn't write his work saying, okay, This is a self-help manual for personal Palestinian freedom. Now get yourself liberated, you and maybe just your family. Like, no, that's not the way it works, right? The liberation starts internally, but it has to move outwards into the world. And so returning to that then helped me, think through the ways in which Palestinian literature is thinking about radical futurity, even if it's somewhere in the background, even if the work feels dystopic, right? There is something to be done there. There is a critique. There is an analysis embedded in Palestinian literature. There is a reflection of Palestinian onto-epistemology, right? Of being and knowing the world that has something really important to teach us. And it's not in just one voice. There is not, just like there's not one American voice in the novel that reflects all of American identity, whatever that means in this place. The same is true for Palestinian literature. It's polyphonic. It's composed of many, many voices. And because of our dispersal, it's composed of many geographies and many languages. The root geography is Palestine, and that is the guiding force. Return is not a metaphor. Decolonization is not a metaphor. That's a whole other conversation and critique we could have, but it's not, right? And so it made me, have these questions about place, the role of place in Palestinian literature, in a literature whose resistance is rooted in Palestine, but exists dispersed over time, space, and language. And so, in thinking about cartography, we have a very contentious relationship with cartography as Palestinians, because cartography in its emergence as a field, not the history of map making. We have a very long history of map making in the Muslim world, but cartography as a European field has been a very violent experience for us. It has fragmented our worlds, literally. And it has led to not only our displacement, but our disenfranchisement, our both physical and psychological estrangement from the land. In 1948, more than, I think, 80% of the Palestinian population were farmers. We also had cities and ports and trade and all of those things. We weren't just one thing, but we have a history of attachment to living from and with the land. And that is destroyed with European cartography coming in and mapping our space and delimiting property and implementing systems of ownership different from our inherited systems of ownership under the Ottoman Empire and then predating even that. So when I started working on this book and trying to think through, okay, what is Palestinian epistemology, or how does Palestinian epistemology know place? I started with a place-based Indigenous reading because going back to what I was talking about with critical theory and comparative literature and kind of struggling with these theorists and how they were relevant to reading Palestinian literature, where sometimes I had wonderful revelations, but a lot of times I was like, this is not working for me. I start reading Indigenous theory and I'm like, oh, it's making sense. Like this resonates. This helps me see what the knowledge in the text. This, not how to read the text, not how to interpret the text, but to actually read the knowledge of the cultural producer here that they're imparting to me. And so I started with a place-centered analysis. And I did that through readings of, I mentioned earlier, Tawfiq Kanaan, who's this embodies a kind of contentious space, important tension at this time, because he calls himself Ibn al-Balad, a son of the country, which is a way, a term that's still used, a way of expressing indigeneity in the Palestinian dialect that translates more to like a native of the land. He's born in Palestine, but at this time when Palestinians and people in Balad Hashem are moving, they're born in a place and they're of that place. His father was from now modern day Lebanon, and he was a Lutheran preacher. So Tawfiq Kanaan has one foot in both worlds, which for him actually doesn't feel strange, just as for most of us inhabiting, more than one world, if we're born into it, is just the world we live in. He's a doctor. He's a preacher's son. He's trained in primarily German and American schools. He marries a German woman. They live in Jerusalem. He works in mostly German hospitals, and he loves Palestine. He recounts in his memoir falling in love with the Palestinian Falah from a young age on these walks that he would go on with his father through the land, to Batir, through Bethlehem, through Jerusalem, through these small villages. And so he is trying to translate to a Western audience, really, what it means to be of Palestine. He's producing his work in the Journal of Palestine Oriental Studies, or something like that, JPOS, Journal of Palestine Oriental Studies, I believe. And these are mostly Europeans, and yet most of the ethnographers at that time were Palestinians. And so he is trying to find a way to counter the kind of cartographic aerial view of Palestine, but also make it legible through Orientalist discourse. It's a mind-boggling kind of way. Like, how do I translate Palestinian epistemologies of place into an Orientalist discourse? It's fraught. And he reproduces certain kinds of ideas of primitivity, that we kind of cringe at reading now. We also recognize that that's endemic to the discourse itself that he's trying to insert himself into, so that these readers can see these people are of the land. They are as from here as you can get. These spatial narratives that they tell of place can be traced back, almost centuries. If we want, he finds resonances of narrative models from biblical texts that are present in the kind of narratives of place we're seeing. And this is very different from the kind of biblical excavations that Orientalist scholars are interested in at the time, because the interest in the kind of biblical remnants of the Palestinian is very much in the vein of Orientalism, where they are static. The Palestinian Falah has ostensibly been frozen in time. If you want to understand the Bible, if you want to understand what it meant to be alive in the time of Jesus, go see the Palestinians, because nothing has changed. They're just these archaic, primitive farmers who know nothing except, these traditions that they've been reproducing for centuries. That is not what he's trying to say. He's trying to say this is a land narrative practice that changes over time, and we can trace some of the ways in which land narrative change. And I give an example of The Lady of the Laurel Tree. So these spatial narratives that exist, I call them land narratives that exist in Palestine, embed a Nabi, a holy person, in a site. So they actually live in the tree or live in the water or live on the mountaintop. And the narrative structure of these tales are pretty constant. They punish who should be punished. They help who is in need of help. And so, Sidna al-Ghara, the Lady of the Laurel Tree, is a site near Beit Nuba, which no longer exists. It was depopulated in 1967 and destroyed. But they venerated this wali, a friend, a saint, wali, a waliya. And in 1917, this story, to give an example of how land narratives are not static, that it's not just this one tale about a holy figure who existed at one time and then it's retold over and over throughout time. She appears in 1917 as the British are invading Palestine, and she holds her sword over her head above the tree and holds them back. And I give that example to say, 1917 was not far removed from when Kanaan was writing. He wrote in the 1920s. So these are living relationships to place through narrative that respond and change over time, but they are also they endure. And that's what he's doing in locating these biblical resonances, which to us can seem highly problematic, but it's not a copy paste of Palestinians are archaic, and here's the evidence of it. What I'm trying to get to in terms of these land narratives and the relation to place in your question about cartography is I look at how he moves through space and how he narrates place and how he's very aware of the cartographic mapping. It would be impossible for him not to be aware because of the circles, intellectual circles he's moving in, of the way Palestine is being mapped at the time by the British, and before that by the Turks, by the Ottoman Empire. And he's giving us a reading of place that is very different. It's not rooted in scientific precision. It's rooted in indigenous knowledge of place, that not bound by time, right? Like the time is like sedimented in place, right? So it's not this linear narrative that we're now used to, like, a pilgrimage from Bethlehem to Jerusalem, or going to Nazareth to follow the path of Jesus or something like that. That's that is not the kind of cartography that he's giving us. He's giving us a relationship to place that is defined by an entirely different set of landmarkers, entirely different way of locating yourself geographically according to stories. And so this carries, we can then say, okay, well, how does something like that carry through? How do you locate that kind of relationship to place in resistance literature, especially when that literature has been dispersed, when the people have been dispersed, right? And this is where my argument about rooted movement becomes so critical, because I said I started in trying to figure out Palestinian epistemology thinking about place-based narrative. And then through conversations with peers and reading more and thinking more, you can't read Palestinian literature without being confronted by exile. So what do? How do you say our literature is place-based if someone like me didn't even I didn't go back to Palestine until I was almost 30 for the first time. Or authors who are writing who can't go back, who are not allowed to enter the territory at all. How do you navigate that? And I realized that if you go back to Tawfiq Kanaan and other writers, the person I compare him to is Raja Shahade, Palestinian Walks, which came out in, I think, 2007, is you can see resonances of this place-based epistemology But it's rooted in movement. They're walking the land. They're not static, narrating or aerial, narrating Palestine from above. Their indigeneity is articulated through movement through the land, through orientations, through narrations of place that are not bound to being in one place. And that helped liberate me in a way, or elucidated what a rooted movement could look like in an analysis of Palestinian literature, where our movement does not just mean displacement. That's an integral part of the story. But to be moved does not just mean to be removed from the land. That the ways in which we move are multiple. It's political movement, it's physical movement, it's epistemological and interdisciplinary movement of our thought, that we're able to think as Palestinians in conversation with others. So movement takes many forms in Palestinian literature, and of course, libertarian movement is critical.
No, that's great. Thank you so much for answering so many questions with this tour de force of an answer. It just brings to mind alternative sort of archival practices that aren't necessarily based in sort of like extractive forms of empiricism, but rather lived experience. So now the body becomes an archive and whatnot. There's a recent literature example of this is The Minor Detail that came out.
Yeah. Such a good book. Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful book. A beautiful book. I read it in I think just 2 sittings.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's a lot of writing that's coming out on that as well. But one constant source of productive tension when you're talking about this rootedness is also you talk about a Palestinian epistemology that's both rooted and constantly moving as well. So rootedness and movement. And this is because of various diasporic tensions and all of these other things. Would you mind talking about this working dichotomy that you have that work dialectically with one another?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So as I talked about a little bit before, it emerges out of that tension. And I tell this a lot to my grad students, and I hope it's not terribly reductive, but so if you're struggling with something, if it's making you feel uncomfortable, go there. That's where you want to go, because it's not the problem. It's where I don't want to say answer is. It's where the really interesting questions are, right? And so, as I said, I started with this place-based analysis with Tawfiq Kanaan and Raja Shahade, and then was trying to think about, what does that mean? And when I came upon this idea of rooted movement, it kind of alighted for me in this word, the word radicality became kind of the opening up for me of how to see Palestinian literature. Also in terms of epistemological violence, because when we hear radicality, there's a certain, depending on, of course, what intellectual traditions you're working with, there's a kind of violence attached to it, right? Often. And so I don't even really address that in the book because it doesn't deserve to be addressed. It's an obfuscation of for example, the Black radical tradition, and the fight for liberation, which is, again, not about violence, it's about freedom. And so I draw in radicality on that tension between the word radical, radix, which draws upon the idea of rootedness, and radicality in the terms of radical change, radical movement, right? This sense of transformation that is central to something that is radical. It's paired with political movement. It's paired with with a sense of transformation. And so my central argument is that Palestinian ways of knowing are really grounded in dynamic ways to this relationship between rootedness and movement. And one work I think that really helped me to see this through a living example was the work of Rima Hamami, who talks about Palestinian thuggish kind of creativity. And what she's talking about is Palestinians at the checkpoint and how Palestinians have innovated to find ways to survive the unsurvivable, or to survive systems that have conspired to prove their civilizational lethargy and therefore the necessity for their extermination. So, for example, we can think about how the occupation produces the very quote unquote uncivilized society that it characterizes Palestinians as, right? So roadblocks and walls and permits and roads that are falling apart. These are created through a system of occupation where Palestinians don't have control over their roads. They don't have control over their movement. Their economy can be stopped with the closing of a gate. And so, in her work, one of the things she's talking about is how Palestinians at these checkpoints have created kind of mini economies for trade and sale, right? But also what she's talking about is the way in which Palestinians find ways to create life and insist upon life through movement. They don't stop going to work. They don't stop going to school. They don't stop, developing an economic system that requires that trucks move from, Qalandia to Ramallah to Bethlehem to deliver goods to a grocery store at the risk of a gate closing and all of the milk in that truck spoils, right? But they do it anyway. And I found in that a really critical example of rooted movement, because we think about sumud, Palestinian steadfastness, sometimes in very reductive ways of like a determination to stay, right? I will not leave my land. You will have to physically remove me. If you destroy my house, I will rebuild it. A settler may come and take over half of my house in Al Khalil, in Hebron, but I'm not leaving my house. Or in Jerusalem, I'm not going to leave my house. And that is a categorical example of sumud. But sumud, resistance, steadfastness, is a form of rooted movement. It responds, it's adaptive. And so Palestinians who insist on going to work, on going to school, on visiting family, on marrying across, the quote unquote green line that doesn't exist. A person in Jerusalem marries somebody in Ramallah and they have to live separately, or, all of these things where life cannot be rendered normal. It cannot exist in whatever that means in a normal way. But Palestinians refuse to not live. That is not an option. And so I think that was kind of a critical entry point for me in thinking about that onto-epistemology of Palestinian ways of knowing and being in the world. That, again, like our resistance isn't going back to that thing we said about the journalist saying, like, if you could just stop your children to hate. That's not what Palestinian resistance is. Palestinian resistance has nothing to do with hating anybody. Palestinian resistance is the determination to live. Just like Rafif says, we love life. Darwish said it, نحن نحب الحياة. We love life if we can find a way to it. And so it's that determination of continuing, find a way to love life. And I think that's something a lot of times we miss in the coverage of Palestine and our victimhood. And I don't want to diminish that, because we are victims of a very cruel settler, colonial, imperial regime and machinations to create an outpost of imperial power in Palestine and in the Arab world. But our resistance to that is rooted in a love for each other and a love for our land, not in a property way, right? Not in like, this is my territory and you shall not enter way, but in a love for the land that has to do with a real like sense of who we are, our very being. I remember the first time walking around Bethlehem, the very first time I went. And, I just ran into someone on the street and was asking directions, and they asked my name and they pronounced it perfectly and they knew who my family was. And it was such a normal encounter for that person. They wouldn't have even thought about it. But for me, I felt at home in a way that I'd never felt at home before. And yet, of course, I was very, very much not at home because my Arabic is imperfect, because I have a bifurcated sense of identity and all of those things. And I've become very accustomed to living, in the in-between. But I think that's something that is very hard to explain to someone whose relationship to the land is rooted in a sense of ownership. I remember talking to my dad once. He in his as he's aged, he started to open up more about Palestine. I think this is also something that resonates with a lot of folks. Our parents start to speak more about things they didn't tell us when they were growing up. And he said, I remember going to pick olives in the olive picking season in fall. And we all went to pick olives. And he's like, that's something they'll never understand, as our attachment to the land. And even just saying it, it sounds so reductive. But it's because it's a lived experience that you can't translate to a way of knowing the land that is rooted in, well, who owns those olive orchards? And, well, how many olives did you get to pick? Well, how many did you get to take? Well, it's like that's not the point of the story. So I think I've gone on a major detour from your question on rooted movement, but it's really about trying to understand a Palestinian epistemology that also doesn't have firm boundaries. And I think that's why the movement is so important. Because, yes, of course, it's about, like I said, physical movement through the land, that act of going, every fall to go pick olives in the olive orchards. But it's also a movement that understands that, like I said earlier, we're not trying to recuperate some kind of authentic pre-colonial way of knowing the world, but like Rima Hamami's discussion of this kind of thuggish creativity in the face of settler immobility, is being responsive to the world, being open to the world, while also being rooted in a sense of community, history, whatever your spirituality of upbringing, might be, ancestry, language, all of these things that enliven a people's history, that in the way that Palestine is known are rendered entirely unknowable from any other non-Palestine-centered kind of thought practice.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing all of these things, including stories and memories and your scholarly knowledge and whatnot. Um, I mean, yeah, recounting knowledge of olive picking and whatnot, very, is Moa Mayer's Netflix.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's,
Yes.
I mean, people critique it in different ways, but it's amazing that it just exists within American television right now. Usually a lot of
It
folks go
is.
to like Watermelon Pictures to find stuff, but now it's like, Netflix has something, which is absolutely incredible
It
for all of
is.
its.
Again, it's that kind of navigating this in between where those critiques are necessary and also just the joy of being able to watch a comedy like Mu'ammar is I think like both can be true, right? We can take joy in it. And those critiques can be there. That's fine. Yeah.
No, that's great. And so before we end, is there anything else you'd like to share or say or something that we didn't get to?
I mean, I could probably go on for hours. I don't think so. I mean, I think I would say if there's anything that felt not quite complete in my answer, or contradictory, or even just not right, I think what I wanted to do with rooted movements was also to create and end this article on the urgency of radical epistemology is create a space of thought and discourse around Palestine that isn't so invested in being right all the time, because this is what gets people scared to talk about Palestine. When I teach about Palestine, I have so many students who I can tell are just scared to speak. Because there is, and rightly so, a hypervigilance and an emotional attachment. And saying the wrong thing can reproduce certain kinds of epistemological violence, right? It's not to undermine the dangers of perpetuating certain ways of knowing. But I, I think that was another desire in trying to think through another way of knowing and being and speaking about Palestine, is that it's okay to um, disagree, as long as the premise for your disagreement isn't my or my people's right to justice and life. If that's there, then I think disagreeing or thinking differently or wanting more clarity or um, recounting a certain fact incorrectly about Palestine isn't a reason to be canceled. And I think there's just so much fear that people have about saying the wrong thing. And again, I get it. But learning is a process that necessitates being wrong sometimes, being wrong a lot of the times. I mean, this is something I have a 5-year-old and a 1.5-year-old, and the 5-year-old really hates to be wrong. um, and trying to remind her and remind myself that learning without making mistakes is not learning. Um, so I think that might be a good place to end on, that this is really an invitation to rethink how we know, to interrogate how we know, and an invitation to think outside the box and maybe make mistakes, but to be curious about Palestine, because it really, really is a door. And I think it's very hard to see that right now through the bleakness, and as it should be. I do not want in any way to diminish the horrors, the absolute unthinkable brutality that my people are facing, both in Gaza and now increasingly in the West Bank. Or not now, for a long time, but the intensity in the East Bank and East Jerusalem is really, really ramping up. But I do also think at the same time it's very, very important for us to try and always focus on imagining what our liberation will be like, because without that, what is there? What is there? yeah, I hope that that's a good place to end it.
Definitely very touching. I would love to also hear and maybe even do an episode basically on what teaching Palestine was like for you, because especially being in the imperial core and all of these things. I mean, what you touched on basically this disagreement, but not a certain type of disagreement. I mean, I personally would probably also love to hear more about teaching, especially in grad school on this subject.
I'd be happy to anytime. This was an absolute pleasure.